Before taking a comprehensive and detailed walkthrough of standard forms, the very documents you're going to receive from buyers, let's establish the overall seller timeline for a real estate transaction. This will provide you the context of how a transaction is structured, along with contract flow and headlights on what's happening at different points in the process, what forms and documents to expect, who needs to sign them and when, and what areas you should be thinking about when it comes to negotiation. You'll see how all of this plays out here. Before we dive in, it's important to keep in mind rather than being regulated, transaction timelines are prescriptive and anecdotal. The exact timing of your transaction will no doubt differ slightly from what you see here based on various dynamics of your deal. Feel free to pause this discussion at any time as well as rewind and review as necessary. The timeline begins on day 0 with an accepted offer and then moves out from there. As a promulgated form, the offer itself and various addenda you might use, if any, the essence of the document is written for you. That's the whole point of a promulgated form. As a non-attorney, you will simply enter various pieces of information into the forms, fill in the blanks, if you will. The dates entered in the offer serve to guide the contract and transaction timeline and flow. But make no mistake, you are actually in control of that. You're entering that information, or in this case, the buyer's agent would be doing that. There's a lot that happens in the 10 business days following an accepted offer. Let's walk through those milestones. 3 days following the offer acceptance date, if you're selling a condominium or a single family home that is part of a homeowners association or HOA, there is typically the condominium documents deadline in which a seller will provide all condominium documents, homeowners association meeting minutes if available, and the budget for the corresponding HOA. These documents are reviewed by both the buyer and the buyer's attorney. For residential property constructed prior to 1978, the seller must sign and furnish to the buyer a lead paint property transfer notification. The buyer must acknowledge and sign this form. Similarly, if the seller plans to provide a seller's real estate information statement, which is simply a voluntary disclosure statement about the property's condition, that would need to be acknowledged by the buyer in writing. The seller's real estate information statement is not mandatory by state law. Within that 10 business day period following offer acceptance, there will be an inspection deadline. Inspections can usually be performed in 1 week following the offer acceptance date, but the deadline to notify the seller of any problems should be no later than the day before the purchase and sale agreement deadline date. And obviously, the seller would prefer sooner. No property is ever perfect, even new construction. So you should prepare your seller for items to be called out on the inspection and perhaps another round of negotiation with the buyer, requesting either items to be addressed and fixed, if you will, prior to closing, or more commonly, a credit to be applied to the purchase price at the closing table as a means to remedy punch list items identified in the inspection. The outcome of any such negotiation will be documented in the purchase and sale agreement, the PNS, by the real estate attorneys. So here's a warning and a pro tip, really. If you're dealing with a newly licensed buyer's agent, ensure they are setting expectations with their client that inspections always surface issues and there are reasonable means to remedy them and still continue forward with a transaction. Don't let inspection items derail your sale. Of course, there are going to be items revealed in an inspection that could kill a deal, yet the vast majority of inspection items are reasonably curable. If a buyer decides to invoke the inspection clause and get out of an offer and take their earnest money with them, it's probably going to be for one of two reasons. Either number one, the buyer's agent was not savvy enough in doing their job in setting expectations with their buyer that all inspections reveal punch list items. Don't delegate authority on this one or assume the buyer's agent has it covered. Take action and do right by your client and the transaction and get in front of this one. Or number two, the buyer really wasn't moving forward in good faith. They really didn't want the home for whatever reason. We then have the signing of the purchase and sale agreement, or P&S, 2 weeks or 10 business days following that offer acceptance date. The P&S is initially drafted by the seller's attorney and then negotiated between the seller's attorney and the buyer's real estate attorney. Buyers typically provide a down payment at the time of P&S signing, which, including the $1,000 earnest money deposit that was provided with the offer to purchase, traditionally equals 5% of the total purchase price. And we'll see how this plays out when we do the walkthrough of forms. It's a little subtle and can be somewhat confusing the first few times you see it. If you're receiving an offer as a listing agent, admittedly, it's a little less confusing because you're just validating the math makes sense. These are anecdotal and seen in practice, but again, exact amounts or percentages are not regulated or mandated by law. The P&S represents both a large and significant hurdle in the transaction life cycle. And once you come out of that, you'll move into loan application. If financing is part of the transaction, the buyer will be required to submit an official loan application, typically no later than 1 day after P&S signing, if it has not yet been done. Keep up your diligence with the buyer's agent here, checking in to ensure the buyer has followed through with that. We then have the appraisal. This is at the discretion of the buyer's lender and is typically conducted within 2 weeks of submitting an official loan application. Here, be engaged and present in assisting with the property appraising at value. While this technically should fall on the shoulders of a buyer's agent, don't simply delegate it to them. This is your deal too, and you want to do right by your seller. You never want to look back on a deal that falls apart, and some do, and say, if I only would have done XYZ, if I only would have been more engaged and had brought more value at this specific point in the transaction. These are really the things, the small, the subtle, that distinguish a high caliber agent from the average. And I know you don't want to be average. Keep in mind, you can automate a lot of this. You should clearly have a process for this. And eventually, as you scale and grow, you may even have a team that does these things on your behalf. So it's not always on your shoulders, if you will. If financing is part of the deal, you'll then hope to reach receipt of a bank commitment letter. Typically 2 weeks, usually a minimum of 10 business days following the signing of the P&S and up to 45 days after. This is the buyer's lender committing to good and sufficient funds provision at the closing table, and for a seller represents the last significant hurdle in a transaction outside of signing the final paperwork. With mortgage loans harder to underwrite and approve, loan commitment deadlines can oftentimes be extended out for at least 30 to 45 days from the signing of the purchase and sale agreement. Buyers should be in frequent conversation with a mortgage lender before making an offer to see how much time is needed to process and approve financing, and you should have your finger on the pulse of this as well. And finally, we have the close, typically no more than 8 weeks after signing the purchase and sale agreement contract. As you might imagine, The timeline could be shortened significantly if we're talking about an all cash transaction or the level of aggressiveness in both the buyer and seller. Some things that aren't really pointed out in either a contract or in writing, but that you will need to expect and or be responsible for might include the following. You can expect that if there is a buyer's agent representing the buyer, that agent's broker will furnish to you and or the seller's attorney an invoice for services, essentially the buyer's agent commission prior to closing. You'll see these amounts called out in both the purchase and sale agreement and the closing disclosure, formerly called a HUD-1 form, at the closing table. Not mentioned in the offer, but you will need to order a smoke and carbon monoxide detector test from the city, attend the inspection, and then provide the pass certificate for successful closing. Once the P&S is signed, it's best to order this test as it can take some time to schedule, and should there be any issues, gives you time to retest. Similarly, if you're selling a condominium, you'll need to present a notarized 6D certificate at the closing table. The 6D certificate outlines that the seller is current on all HOA dues and the like. You will coordinate a final walkthrough of the property for the buyer, conducted as close to the closing date and time as possible. Typically, these take place the morning of closing. You want to ensure your client brings a driver's license, state identification card, or passport to closing. Ensure you facilitate bringing all keys to the property to the closing table. If your brokerage is holding escrow, meaning the earnest money deposit and the additional deposit collected at time of P&S signing, ensure it's brought to the closing. Interest is not typically earned on these funds any longer, but if it is, that will need to be accounted for as well. Determine if the buyer's mortgage broker, as necessary, requires a cashier's check at closing. Ensure all parties are on the same page with how funds need to be provided at the closing table. You don't want to run into a last minute glitch on this particular point. Fantastic. Now that we've established the overall seller timeline for a real estate transaction, you've got the context of how a transaction is structured, contract flow, the framework for what's happening at different points in the process, and which forms and documents to expect. This is the perfect time for us to do a detailed walkthrough of the standard forms, and that's where we'll go next.